At When We're Not Hustling, we believe that seeing sex workers as full people outside of our work is an essential step towards humanizing and destigmatizing the industry and those who work within it. Help us to bring you the stories of the people behind the fantasies. When We're Not Hustling is a 501c3 fiscally sponsored nonprofit project of the Social Good Fund. Thank you for considering a tax-deductible recurring contribution. All contributions will be received through our fiscal sponsor, the Social Good Fund. You can contribute at nothustling.com. Thank you so much.
Put away the lingerie. I want to know you. Tell me more. I don't care about the news. I'd rather hear about you and see the world from your point of view. The coffee's already made, so I probably should just pull up a chair and tell me more.
Welcome to When We're Not Hustling, a podcast where sex workers talk about everything but. I'm your host, Jessie Sage. When We're Not Hustling is a weekly podcast that explores the lives and identities of sex workers outside of our work personas, our personal philosophies, ambitions, families, relationships, passions, spirituality, and so much more. We talk about our lives beyond the job, asking, what does the flexibility of sex work allow us to do, and who does it allow us to be? On this show, we learn who sex workers are outside of the work we're known for. When We're Not Hustling is an exploration of the people behind the fantasies. When We're Not Hustling is powered by Black Venom Digital. Black Venom Digital is a collaboration between myself and industry veteran Mr. Black Venom. Black Venom Digital aims to provide adult professionals and entrepreneurs with professional-grade web design, graphic design, and branding services that will inspire growth and success. At Black Venom Digital, we empower companions, creators, and entertainers with professional web design and branding. If you're looking for a new website or any other branding services and you work in the adult industry, please find out more at blackvenomdigital.com. Welcome back to another episode of When We're Not Hustling. I am your host, Jessie Sage. This is the last week of September, and today we have on Stephanie Parent. That means that this is the last week that we're going to have our after party guest, Melody Garcia, on. You're going to want to check out her last after party appearance on Wednesday after this one comes out. And then next month, we are going to return to an old favorite of the show, Melissa Milk. She'll be joining us for all of the October episodes. But this is the last September one. I am very excited to have Stephanie Parent on. In the middle of last month, we had on Charlotte Shane, who dropped a new book, An Honest Woman. If you haven't listened to that podcast, I suggest you go back and listen to that conversation. It was great. I'm excited to bring back another published author this week. So this week, we're going to have on Stephanie Parent, who's a graduate of the Masters of Professional Writing program at USC. And she is also a professional submissive and switch. So that'll be really fun to have her on. She also just published a book. Her book came out in May of 2023, and it's called The Briars. It's a gothic horror novel that's set in a fictionalized version of the dungeon in LA that she worked in, and it's coming out on Cemetery Gates Media, or it came out in May on Cemetery Gates Media. We're going to be talking about the book that she wrote, how that integrated with the other work that she's done, how much of it is real to her life and how much of it is fictionalized. We're going to talk about the process of writing a horror novel and what psychologically that entails. And she's also going to read some poetry. So I'm really excited to bring you her interview. Before I get to her bio and turn to the interview, I want to remind you to check us out on our website, nothustling.com. And if you're a sex worker who wants to appear on the show, there is a contact form there that you can use to send us a proposal. I also want to remind you that you can find us on socials at Not Hustling Pod on X and Instagram. And we are also on Patreon at patreon.com/sapiotextual. Additionally, you can watch, if you want to watch the video component, you can watch all of the after parties on YouTube, and that's youtube.com/sapiotextual. Let me go ahead and introduce Stephanie. After working for 6 years at a commercial dungeon in Los Angeles, she has been writing about her personal and professional experiences with BDSM for publications including The Huffington Post, Hippocampus, Pithead Chapel, Entropy, The Horticulturist, and Mookie Chick. Her work has been anthologized in Dating and Sex, The Mutual Theory of Self-Destruction, and Slut Vomit, an anthology of sex work. Her first poetry collection, Every Poem is Potion, Every Song a Spell, was released in August 2022 from Curencia Press. And her debut novel that I was just telling you about, The Briars, came out in May of 2023 from Symmetry Gates Media. So let's turn to her interview. Welcome, Stephanie. It is great to have you as a guest today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so you are a writer and you've written a novel or a couple of novels. Is that right?
One novel so far that's published, one novel, one poetry collection, and one short nonfiction collection.
Nice. And you're also in the Holy Hour, right?
Yes. I have a poem in that book. Yes.
Were you at the event?
I was okay. Quiet. I'm a shy person.
So you didn't go on stage, right?
No, I did not. I did not go on stage. No.
Yeah.
But I was definitely there. It was amazing to be there and to see all the energy and excitement around this book about sex work.
Yeah.
It was very inspiring.
It was really exciting. And a couple of the people who've been on the show are also in the book. So Madeline Blair was there and she's in the book.
Yes,
Chloe Nova.
I listened to Madeline's episode. So definitely I agreed with a lot of what you were talking about in that episode.
I felt like kind of a jerk in that episode because I was like, I don't like that writer. I don't like that one either. But I mean, I don't dislike them as writers. I just had like beefs with the way that they depicted sex work and some other things. But for the most part, they were good. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your background. How long have you been in sex work and when did you start writing?
So I had dabbled in sex work a little bit earlier than this, but I guess I would say that I really started in 2013. That was when I started working at a dungeon. So I guess it's been more than 10 years, which is crazy. Although I was not doing it during the pandemic. So did have a little time off there. But yeah, I started working at a commercial dungeon while I was living in Los Angeles in my very late 20s was the time that I started doing that. I'd moved out there to go to grad school. I'd finished grad school, kind of had some low paying jobs and was just trying to make it as a writer. Didn't really know what I wanted to do, but I was very curious. I'd always been curious about different forms of sex work and also about BDSM. Just very curious, but also very nervous. So finally, found a place that was hiring and took the leap, and that was that.
Did you read? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but did you read Chris Belcher's book, Pretty Baby?
Not yet, but I have it. I've seen it. Yeah, I've read about it.
In LA.
I own it. Yes, I do want to read that one.
Yeah, in Dungeons in LA, and it's really good. That book is really good.
Okay, I'll move that up on my reading list.
I, for like a hot minute, hosted a sex worker book club, and she was one of the books that we talked about in that book club. So it was fun. Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. And so tell me a little bit about your writing. So actually, right before we started talking, I was asking you about the fact that you write under the name Stephanie Parent, and that's not your sex work name, but your regular name, your legal name.
It's my regular name. Yes.
Do you want to tell me why you decided to do that? Actually, I'm sorry.
Keep going.
Yeah. It's actually interesting because when I was talking to Chris Belcher, she was saying that like, that's her real name, but she wrote that book that was the first thing that she wrote under her real name. She wrote otherwise under Natalie West, like most of the sex.
Oh, I didn't know they
Natalie
were the same person. Okay. Yeah. That's good to know.
Yeah. And so it's interesting, but you were saying that all of your work is under your real name. All of my work is under my sex work name. So it's like interesting how sex working writers make these choices. So I was curious how you did that.
There were a couple reasons. I came back. I'd wanted to be a writer before I got into sex work. I had finished my grad school program in writing and had agents tried to get some young adult novels published, things of that nature. So I already had like short stories published under my name. And in fact, some of them were not sex work, but they were kind of adjacent in topics. But yeah, so I'd already had stuff published under my name. And then when I came back to it, originally what I wanted to write was not about sex work. It was about sex. It was definitely about BDSM and kind of inspired by my experience at the dungeon. But this book idea had just come to me and it was fiction. I guess you could actually even say it was a little bit about sex work because I wanted to write about like spanking videos in the 1950s.
Is that what your book is about?
No, I never finished. I never finished this one, but maybe I should come back to it. Yeah,
I think that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. But so when I was thinking I was going to write this book, I was assuming I would do it under my real name because I'd always kind of wanted to be a writer under my real name, and why not? But I was struggling to have time to write. I was just doing so many jobs at one time. And I was just kind of losing my mind over how I was going to finish. So somebody got me a call with an agent, like just an advice call. And I mentioned that I worked at the dungeon because I was wondering if I could use it for promotional purposes. Like I'm writing this book that's about BDSM and where the characters are in spanking videos. And that's similar to what I've done. So could I use this? And this agent, I don't know that this was the best advice, especially since, you know, we barely knew each other. But she was just kind of like, well, why don't you just write a memoir first? And if you write a memoir, you can sell it on proposal. So it doesn't have to be finished because it's nonfiction.
Right.
Which is only sometimes true. Honestly, I feel like that's probably more true if you already have a big platform, which I did not. So I don't know if it was the best advice. It may have been because it was pre-pandemic. And I feel that everything kind of changed once the pandemic happened. But
so that's what she said. Can you like talk a little bit for people who aren't familiar with the process and how that works, like what that advice meant? So what she meant is that if you have nonfiction, you can sell it before it's finished, but that's not true for fiction books, or?
Yep, that's pretty much it. So for fiction, you pretty much always have to have a finished book, unless you're already an established writer. You might be able to sell like your fourth or fifth novel on an outline and proposal, but as a beginning author, it has to be finished and polished. Nonfiction. So for memoir, it actually varies. What people have different opinions. Honestly, if you're a literary memoir writer and you don't have a huge platform, it's probably better if your book is finished. So this probably was not the best advice. But when you think of other forms of nonfiction books where generally the author would have a big platform, so this could include if I had been writing like an academic study of sex work, or a book where I interviewed a lot of people about sex work or something like that, then what you could do is you would write a sample chapter of the book, like maybe the first chapter and another chapter later in the book. And then you would have an outline of the rest of the book and a proposal for how you were going to market it, why people would want to read it, this or that. And a publisher may buy it based on that and pay you to finish it. So that was kind of what was in my mind when I started writing nonfiction. But to be honest, it was a little like delusional on my part. I was I just needed something to keep myself going. Like I needed some belief that this was going to go somewhere. So it just
why do you think it was delusional?
Because
that it would get bought, or
that it would get bought as a literary memoir on proposal. Because it's pretty rare that happens unless you're already famous or have a big platform in some way. And even when the book did eventually go on submission, and I realized from some of the comments on the rejections that it probably would have been better if I'd finished it, because it just wasn't, the narrative arc of it wasn't as clear as it would have been if I had finished it. but because of that, so I decided to like start writing some little pieces, little articles. I thinking about getting the platform. So I was like, okay, let me write some articles and see if I could get those published and start to get a platform.
Yeah.
And then start working on the memoir, this or that. And then one of the first places that answered me when I started to write these articles and pitches and send them out was the Huffington Post, which I thought was a really big deal at the time. I've since found that they publish a lot of sex work stuff and just a lot of stuff in general. So it's not
they do
necessarily
publish a lot of sex work stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so it's not necessarily that big deal, but I thought it was. So
it's still a big deal. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, I was just like, I'm going to do anything to get this published. This is my big break. I'm going to do this. So they did tell me that it had to be under my full legal name.
The Huffington Post told you that?
Yeah, because it's a news article. And I mean, I question that now because I see other articles they've published and I'm pretty sure this was a pseudonym. I'm pretty sure if I had told them to just use my first initial, if I told them that was my name, they would have done, I think I could have gotten around it, but I just was so really, really wanted this to happen. So I just wanted to do everything right. So I published that under my full name, but at the same time, as I started, I was writing a lot of little excerpts from the memoir and trying to get them published. And some of them I did publish under my initials because I was still like kind of unsure of what I was going to do. My initials and my last name. But I also had that idea in my head that if I did get the whole memoir published, I wanted it under my real name because I'd always been trying to publish under my name. And there's something about when you are writing a memoir, there's something about it being under your real name that I think makes some readers feel like it's a bit more raw or authentic. I don't know that that's necessarily true, but it's like, a marketing thing. And also when I did get another agent and she told me the same thing, she was like, it's probably best to just do it under your real name.
So interesting because
dungeon work is legal. So it's a little different than, if I was writing about some other forms of work.
I was thinking that's so interesting though, because for me, like I write under my name that I did online sex work under for a long time and that I podcast under and that I've built my brand under. And I had the same experience as you where I pitched an article. Actually, I didn't even pitch it. Somebody came to me and said, hey, would you write an article for us? And I didn't even know where he worked. And I was like, okay, sure. But who am I writing it for? And he's like, you mean who reads the articles? And I'm like, no, like what is the publication? And he's like, the Washington Post. And I was like, what? Like, how did this just happen? Because they're like such a huge, like well-known, well-respected publication. And so I was like, that to me felt like a big deal. And I was like, yes, I will write this for you. And then we went through several rounds of edits and I poured a ton of energy into it because it seemed like a big, like kind of break for my freelance writing. And then like the day before it was supposed to go out, they were like, oh, by the way, you can't use your stage name. And I was like, I hemmed and hawed under that because I didn't want to about that because I didn't really want to come out with my real name. And it was an article about sex work. But then I figured like, I can't really give up like this opportunity. But the weird thing about this now is that like I have an entire writing career that I've built under Jessie Sage and I have one byline under my real name and it's a Washington Post piece. So it looks like I like am this like totally unknown entity who wrote one article like in my whole life, and
that's the internet is so frustrating that way. And with the Googling and what and comes up and doesn't.
And it seems so dumb because like, I totally hear what you're saying about like not writing under a pseudonym, but for a lot of sex workers and for other people who've like have safety reasons or reasons that they don't necessarily write under their real name, like I associate more with the name Jessie Sage than I do with my legal name because like I built my whole like career on that. And so it seems to me like it would almost feel the opposite if I were to write under my real name where I'm like an unknown person, except for this one article.
Yeah, it does feel a little weird. And if I were to start over, I would probably not publish that Huffington Post article because I did not appreciate the way it was edited either. But I would probably do my initials.
I've never written for them.
Yeah, I think I just had a bad experience because I think the editor that I had was like going through a lot, and she kind of put it off to the same last minute, and then it got pushed onto somebody else. I feel bad talking about like this, but this was pre-pandemic, so she's probably not even there anymore. I think it felt like it got pushed onto like an intern or something. Like it got really chopped up, and there were mistakes in it that weren't my mistakes and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what happens with some of these news publications that publish so much stuff, you know?
Right. Mm-hmm. Especially with freelancers, they just put less. I feel like they put less time and energy into it.
Yeah.
And they pay us. They pay us very little for those pieces, and then just kind of cycle them through.
Yep.
Yeah.
But it was a long time ago, and it was a learning process, and it kind of forced me to continue writing about this. And, maybe I would have stopped, and it brought me a lot more opportunities in the future because I did it. So.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about your novel that you wrote and then what you're working on now.
So the novel is called The Briars, and it's actually a gothic horror novel, a ghost story, but it's set at a dungeon. It's basically the dungeon I worked at. I really didn't change anything. It's very true to life, but it's a ghost story. So that part is not true to life.
Yeah.
Although it is inspired by the dungeon that I worked at. There was a rumor that the original owner haunted it. So that was part of the inspiration. Yeah, really. Yeah. Like, and a lot of people believed it. A lot of people would say that they saw signs of her, and there was a special room named after her, and things like yeah. And definitely her presence was hanging over the dungeon in many ways. She was always talked about. There were many pictures of her. Many things were still done the way that she had done them. So,
did people like her? Was she well liked, or was she not well liked?
I think she was. She had died before I started working there. But yeah, I got the idea that she was well liked, but she was definitely a strong personality. She was definitely a woman ahead of her time, like very independent. I think she was the only female dungeon owner at her time, and she started it in the 80s. So definitely like a very strong, independent woman figure.
But, so was your experience at the dungeon then, like, how did that play into the material of the book?
I mean, it was definitely a huge influence because I'd been writing the memoir, and that died on submission. I was with an agent at the time, and just nobody wanted it, and it wasn't finished. So I was like, and my agent was like, it is easier to sell a novel. So it's like, okay, let me kind of rework this as a novel. So my mind was already in the place. This was during the pandemic, and I moved back to Baltimore. So I was not anywhere near the dungeon. The dungeon actually closed at that time. They closed because of the pandemic. So, but my mind was very much in the place of the dungeon because I had been writing about it so much. So it was very easy for me to still be kind of living there. In my
in your head,
in my mind. So in various ways it was inspired by my real situations. Because it was a horror novel, I kind of drew on some of the bad experiences I'd had and the not so nice clients, and exaggerated those a lot to create the horror aspect of it. And also kind of like the idea of violence against sex workers being a real issue that was driving the horror aspect of the novel. But then there was also a lot of the female community aspect, which was my favorite part of working there, and the support among women and friendships and romantic relationships. And even the ghost story kind of played into that, with the idea of the ghost kind of guiding the current dungeon owners and protecting them from the more negative experiences with clients or with being a sex worker. So a lot of that.
So I'm curious about this. Like, what was it like for you to kind of dramatize the violence against like sex workers? Was that, as a sex worker yourself, was that a difficult thing to process and to do? Or
I think it was more cathartic for me. I mean, it was difficult because it was a horror novel. Like, I wrote about people getting murdered, and I had to put myself in that headspace of what would this feel like. So that part, it was definitely difficult. But yeah, it was cathartic for me, I think, and helped me work through some situations that I had been in. I made everything a little more dramatic because it's a book. But that's always actually a problem that I've had in my life, is that I tend to minimize my own experiences because I'll think, oh, this is not that bad because something worse happened to somebody else. So I don't really deserve to like feel upset that this happened to me, type thing.
Yeah.
So I think maybe dramatizing it and making it worse in the book, and then making these women triumph in the end and get revenge in the end. It was good for me to kind of like work through my own feelings a lot.
Yeah.
And since publishing it, like I feel that the dungeon itself, not sex work, but the dungeon in particular, like that period of my life is now behind me. It feels like it was much further in the past, and I don't think about it as much. So I think I've healed from the negative aspects of it, and held on to the good aspects.
Yeah, which is the best you can do. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that that's a really common thing for women to do, but for like people who've experienced trauma to do, to like minimize their own experiences as not being what they thought. You know, it's interesting because I remember, you know, not to get too far down this like line of thought, but as you were speaking, I was thinking about going to see a client who I had a not good experience with, and calling who at the time was my assistant, or texting her like right after the session was over and saying to her, watching myself type out, oh, well, I wasn't afraid he was going to hurt me. And then like looking at that and being like, that's the weirdest thing that I just said, because I was like, why would I be afraid of that? He already did.
Yeah.
Yes, I didn't have to be afraid because it wasn't hypothetical. It was a reality. And it took me a little bit of time and like introspection to be like, why am I downplaying this as if like, I was just like, oh, he was kind of an asshole, but it wasn't that bad. And then I was like, no, it actually was, you know,
yeah,
it actually was a bad experience. And I had to catch myself minimizing. I caught myself minimizing my own experience. And that's, I think, not that unusual for people. Like, I mean, we do that as a way of protecting ourselves too, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah. But I also think that like there's something, and I've had these experiences too, that feels very powerful and cathartic about like taking that back by like telling the story yourself in the way that like you want to tell it.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you have any fears that people who were at the, you know, I know it's a novel, but I always feel like in writing, like I feel like this, and I'm just an essayist, but like, I feel like a lot of times when I write things, people who know me or who've had like interactions with me tend to read themselves into my work, even if it's not about them. And I was wondering if you had fears about people reading it. And
I did not have any fears that any of the clients who were in it would read it. I just don't think they would come across it. Like it came out from a very small press. But also it's a long book. It's a literary book. Like people just don't read that much. Like, like I think there's probably more risk of that with an article. But I did have, I think at least one, I don't know if more than one client who read the book, but he was not in it. But it was okay that he read it, but definitely with coworkers. But I mean, they were all positive portrayals, and I'm not sure how many read it, but the few that did, like they seem to have a positive reaction to it. And I did have a little worry about that. And I'm a little relieved that I think I'm going to move on to writing more solely fictional things from now on, now that I kind of got that out of my system. But I guess it is what it is. That's kind of what happens when you're a writer and people read your work.
I saw one time Anne Lamott said, who I really liked, wrote, because she's a nonfiction writer, and she wrote somewhere, or I saw her on an interview say something like, if people don't, like, you need to write your own truth, and if people don't like how they're depicted, they should have acted better.
Yeah.
That always amused me. But then like and I would like to feel that. So I would like to be that flippant about that because it would make writing easier. But I found when I was trying to work on a memoir which was bought, but then I pulled it from the press that like for a lot of political reasons. But one of the things that stopped me from finishing it was like not feeling ready to talk about some of the things, especially with the people who were like close to me, like family members. And that's not the kind of book you ended up writing, but I think that that's a hard thing about being a writer.
Yeah, definitely agree.
Yeah. So what are you working on now?
Well, I finished a poetry book that's coming out next year, and that's probably going to be my last time of writing about the dungeon because I've written a lot about it. It's not just about the dungeon, the poetry book, but it does mention it. It's the poetry book. It's pretty confessional, like nonfiction poetry, but it was also the first time that I really wrote about like an emotionally abusive relationship I was in at the same time that I was at the dungeon, and also really got into some of the OCD, like negative self-image and a little bit of like self-harm type things that I got into while I was at the dungeon, and then getting out of those things. So that's done. So I actually kind of need to start a new big project, but I really haven't yet. I have like a couple ideas brewing, but I need to do more research. And for me, research is usually reading like folk tales or fairy tales or things like that, because I tend to be inspired by that a lot. Like in the Briars, I read a lot of ghost stories from different cultures about female ghosts. And yeah, so I need to read some things and kind of let things brew in my mind. That's what I tend to do. But yeah, I want to go back to writing more fiction that's I feel like I have room to breathe now. Like I'm in a better financial place, so I can take it slowly. So I kind of want to maybe try characters who are farther from me and my experience, and take a broader stroke and try some new things.
When We're Not Hustling is brought to you by Assembly 4. Assembly 4 is a collective of sex workers and technologists working to bring the overall cost of sex work down through their advertising platform, Tryst.link. They also educate clients through the Good Client Guide and provide resources and articles written by and for sex workers. Assembly 4 caters to all genders and demographics and raises funds to fight for sex worker rights and against exploitation in the sex industry. Learn more at assembly4.com. ASSEMBLYFOUR.com. Thank you for listening to When We're Not Hustling. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Doing so will help other people find us. And if you're a sex worker who wants to come on the show and talk about your life outside of work, we would love to have you. Please send an email with more information to nothustlingpod@proton.me. How do you, this might sound like a dumb question, but I'm coming from the place of somebody who's never written any fiction before. And so I'm curious, like, how do you make up a character? Like, what is your process for like making up a character and thinking about like people who aren't you or people that you know?
Yeah, I don't know how I do that, because I never really thought about it like in those terms. Like with major characters, I guess I'm somebody who spends a lot more time thinking about my writing than actually writing it. So I'll just kind of start thinking.
All writers.
Yeah, I guess. So I'll start like thinking about them and their backstories, like while I'm, walking around or doing chores or whatever, and just start like imagining what they look like or how they move through the world, and like get a picture of them in my mind, and things like that. But for minor characters, it's different. At least so far, what I've noticed is that I'll kind of do placeholders as I'm writing. Like they'll be very vague, the minor characters, like they'll just be like names. And then as when I go back to further drafts, I'll give them a little more personality. Like maybe something will happen later. Like I think this happened in the Briars. One of the characters later in the book, like she picked a cool outfit. So that was very matchy with her. She was matching actually her cast to her outfit. She had a broken arm. Then I was like, oh, this character likes fashion. So I was able to go back to every scene that she was in earlier and kind of work in that she was into fashion. And then she was also like, had struggled with anorexia in the past. And I was like, oh, it was because she liked to read fashion magazines. So it all like fitted together. And I didn't even, hadn't even know, so.
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
I think that it's with the minor characters, that's one place where you can like, that can be a weakness in a lot of books is if the minor characters are not fleshed out at all and they're kind of just there to advance the plot. So,
right.
So I like to think about giving them little bits of personality too.
Yeah. That's interesting. The idea of like placeholders and then going back in and like filling out different parts of their story once they kind of flesh themselves out later in the book. Yeah. I was in the car the other day and I was listening to NPR and they were interviewing the guy who wrote the book that preceded the movie Crazy Rich Asians. That's the name of the movie, right? Yeah. So I
think it's the book also.
Yeah.
It's
so
the same name.
The author of the book was on. And at first I didn't realize that he was talking about like a book he wrote. Cause if you like get in the middle of an interview and he's talking about these like people and their motivations. And then all of a sudden he's like, oh, my characters. And I'm like, oh, wait, I thought he was talking about like real people. I didn't know they were all like invented characters of his imagination. And it was this moment that I was like, oh my gosh. Fiction writers are amazing because I don't have that kind of, or at least I haven't ever practiced that kind of like imagination of like bringing people into the world that aren't here yet. And so I find that so fascinating.
Yeah, I think I'm definitely a very character-based writer. That's my favorite part. My weakness would probably be more with moving the plot along.
Yeah.
But it's definitely the idea of the characters and their emotions that that excites me to write.
That's what excites me as a reader to read, is more that. And also movies. Like I like movies that are very like character driven too. I like to joke that I like movies where like nothing actually happens, because there isn't a strong narrative arc. It's just like, here are these people and here's how they relate to each other. And that's always the most interesting to me. Yeah. So do you not work in dungeons anymore?
Not in dungeons. I just work independently now.
Okay.
And it's interesting that like a lot of the negative experiences that I had great experiences at the dungeon, and I'm so glad I worked there. And the community was so invaluable, and I would not have gotten that working independently. But a lot of the negative experiences, and especially the ones that kind of lasted longer, were the result of like working in a group setting under someone who owned it, and who had a financial stake in it. Like that caused a lot of issues. So that's interesting to think about, like, when somebody other than you has a vested interest in making sure that these clients are seen and are paying, like, it leads to a lot more exploitation and doing things you don't necessarily want to do, or that type of thing.
Yeah, I've never worked like that. I've never worked in a strip club or in a dungeon or in a brothel or anything. So I've always been independent, and so I haven't had those experiences, but I have had jobs before. So
it's similar. Yes.
So it makes sense to me that would be true, because they do have a vested interest in keeping the clients. They make more money off the clients, obviously, and especially return ones. And that's the thing that I love about being like an independent sex worker, but also just like a freelancer. Like all of the things that I do out inside of sex work and outside of sex work is just this way of being able to be like, that's not really what I want to do. I'm going to pivot and do something else, and nobody's going to say anything about that at all.
Yep.
Yeah. But on the other hand, like you say, I've never worked in a community with people. I haven't had people. I think
it's especially important when you're starting out in BDSM. I feel like unless you already are a part of a pretty like strong BDSM community, and maybe even then, if you haven't done it professionally, it's very different. I think it's really important to be part of that group, because especially if you're at my dungeon, everybody had to start out as a sub, whether they were actually submissive or not. But especially if you are actually submissive, it's hard to know, what's acceptable and what isn't. Like what is actually doming and what is just somebody not knowing how to use a toy or somebody like taking advantage. So there's a lot of teaching and learning that goes on that I think is important, but it's almost like an apprenticeship. You're not necessarily making the same type of income that you would if you did it on your own.
Right. Well, yeah, because there's somebody else taking like a cut of that. And yeah. But then you also don't have to do any of the like advertising or anything.
At our dungeon, the advertising was not good.
So you still wanted to do some of that. Yeah.
I mean, I didn't like, we didn't think to do it, or there wasn't really any encouragement to do it, but no, it was very stuck in the past kind of. So like a lot of the clients were the same clients who'd been coming since like even the 90s, probably, it was crazy. It was very like, let's rely on the clientele we already have, even though they're getting really, really old, and let's not try to drive in a lot of new clientele. So it was,
that's interesting. Yeah. So you told me that you've been both like a dominatrix and a submissive, like a pro sub. What was your experience like as a pro sub?
So that was really what I did most of the time. I learned to switch later and could do dom sessions, but I was mostly a pro sub. So, it's a really interesting and pretty unique experience. And actually I was, listening to your episode that you did earlier, with Madeline Blair, where you talked about, Melissa Febos. I don't know if I'm saying her name right. Is it Febos?
Yeah.
Yeah. Her book about dungeons. And that was what kind of,
Whip Smart.
Kind of was what rubbed me wrong about her book, is that I think there was like a line in there about how you have to be damaged to be a submissive, something along those lines. And there was definitely kind of that undertone of that. So that really, really rubbed me the wrong way.
Yeah.
And I think
that whole book rubbed me the wrong way, but I've already gotten into that in a previous episode.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think that's true. I think there's like so many different reasons that somebody would be drawn to being a submissive. I think some people are just kind of born with those fantasies, or they maybe arose out of a trauma or just out of a childhood where they felt like they didn't have a lot of control for whatever reason. But it can be a really healthy way to work out those feelings. And sometimes it's just about being a bit of a masochist in a good way, where like feeling
or just a
pain,
sensation seeker.
A sensation seeker, like feeling pain helps you to get an emotional and physical release, and it almost feels like being high. And the feeling of like being tied up, being physically constrained can be very emotionally freeing. So there's so much cool stuff that goes along with being a pro sub. It's really an amazing experience. But because it is, especially if you haven't done it a lot in your personal life and you're new to it all, it is going to be very emotional and very impactful and draining. It is hard to do it professionally because there's not necessarily the same type of consent. Like, of course you can say no, but you can't really say no to every single thing or to every single person, because you're there to do the job, so you're doing it with people you maybe wouldn't have chosen to do it with, and maybe people who are a bit pushier, or so it does get complicated in that way, and kind of it maybe over time will twist your relationship to your submissive side a bit. That's certainly what happened to me, because like if you really enjoyed something, like enjoyed being spanked and then getting a release from that, but then have some clients who maybe spanked the wrong place on purpose over and over, like if you spank the tailbone or the side of the hips, that's not a good thing to do, and people do that kind of on purpose, and it kind of like ruin the activity for you. But it makes you a lot stronger. So I don't think that it makes you weaker or that you continue to seek it out because you're damaged. I think it can make you stronger, and you can kind of work through those feelings over time. And like personally, I got to a place where I can still enjoy a lot of those activities, but I don't I don't make myself quite so vulnerable in doing them, and I don't like need them the same way. So I think it really helped me psychologically to kind of work through a lot of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people, when I tell them that I did that, they're shocked because it does in some senses seem to be one of the most vulnerable types of sex work you can do. If you think like if you're letting somebody tie you up or blindfold you or gag you and hurt you, you know, it's a little crazy. But could also be fun. I mean, a lot of the sessions were really lighthearted and fun. It wasn't always serious, you know, and there was a lot of tickle sessions too.
That I have to say, a tickle session is probably the last thing on the planet that I would do. Like,
it's pretty challenging.
I hate being tickled. Like, it is the only thing that will make me like, maybe not the only thing, but like so far, it's the only thing I can think of that like would really make me like violent. Like if somebody's tickling me, I will do like anything to get out of being tickled. I hate it. And every once in a while people will reach out and be like, oh, do you do tickle sessions? And I'm like, absolutely not. Like in no circumstance. But I don't know. I have like a visceral reaction to that. It seems terrible to me. But yeah, I've had on this show, a friend of mine, Honey Daniels on, and they're a pro-submissive, in Philly. And it was so interesting to hear them talk about it. They didn't talk about it on this show, but they talked about it with me on another show I used to host. And one of the things that they said that I hadn't really thought about is that a lot of what they were doing as a pro sub was teaching people who doing a lot of teaching of people who wanted to be more dominant, but didn't necessarily have the skills or didn't know how to negotiate that with their partner or wasn't sure how to go about it. And so Honey was saying that most of their time is spent with people who are like, I really want to be dominant, but I don't really know what that looks like, or I'm not exactly sure how to do that. And them and Honey kind of playing the role of like, this is what it should look like when you're with somebody else. This is how you should be doing things with them. And that's something that I hadn't thought about prior to talking to them about it.
Yeah, for sure. At the dungeon that I worked at, because so many of the clients had been going there for a really long time and were really set in their ways, and they were often the clients who would see new submissives. So there wasn't really a lot of that when you were just starting. Yeah, because you were learning too, usually. Like in between sessions, you know, women who'd been there for longer would tell us stuff, or like if someone saw a bruise on the side of my hip, they would be like, "Oh, did you let somebody hit you there? That's not a good place. You shouldn't let somebody hit you there." Like things like that. But definitely once I'd been there longer and knew more and felt more comfortable, I would say things like that. But where that really came in at the dungeon was after becoming a switch, or if you would do a session with like a switch and a sub, like a double session, that would happen sometimes, like a switch and a sub with a client. If the client was new, that was something we would often suggest to them. So the switch and the client could dom the sub together. And when the client started to fumble, then the switch could step in and be like, actually, let's do it this way. And like, it was kind of a fun way to teach them. So those were some of my favorite sessions.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. So you wrote a poem for the Holy Hour, and I would love it if you would read us your poem.
Definitely. Okay.
So can you give us a little background on it first?
Yeah, so I think I wrote this particular poem with the prompt of spirituality and the intersection of sexuality and spirituality and sex work, and it came from I think when I was fantasizing about being a sex worker. And when I first started, I really just wanted to be desired. Like I was definitely the traditional girly girl growing up, and I really played into a lot of those stereotypes in some ways. Like I loved fairy tales, and you know, I wanted my fairy tale, like I wanted to be the beautiful princess, and never really felt like I was good enough. So, or even, you know, more just modern stuff. Like I read a lot of fashion magazines and just always was, you know, a little too concerned with my image and things of that nature. But But then I think doing sex work kind of helped me work through that, because first I did get what I wanted. You get a lot of people, a lot of clients like saying how much they desire you. And it's not necessarily that people didn't desire you outside of that. It's more that it's more acceptable to state it or to act on it within the sex work
context. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But in addition, like you kind of get jaded on it, or you realize that it doesn't fulfill you in the way you thought it would. So it helps you work through that a lot, I think. Helped me personally to work through that. So that's kind of what this poem was about. And this is going to be also in my upcoming collection that's coming out next year.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Okay. So I'll read it now. Okay. Sacrifice. Desire was my religion. My want for them to want me overtook my sky. Great clouds descended from the heavens. My body's own needs, flowers withering without sun, meant less than nothing. I was a worshiper yearning to be made into an idol, placed on a pedestal, trapped under glass, a blossom in a greenhouse. I did not understand the consequences of desire, how idols are created to be broken down, become receptacles for another's excrement, abandoned to bleed out. My belly filled with my own regrets, clawing from the inside out. I had made the wrong choice not to own what was mine, to hollow it out, give it away, strap myself to the cross, and await attention and abandonment both, as if anyone else's eyes, hands, desire, degradation, devotion, desertion, anyone else's religion could ever define who I am, what I own.
That's so good.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was great. And so interesting, because I think earlier in the interview, you said something about the fact that like, as you moved along in sex work, you didn't need the same things from your clients that you did at the beginning. I think I've had a similar experience, like where things change over time and you realize you do realize that other people can't give you things that like they can't fill you. You have to feel full on your own. And I think that's what I heard from your poem, and what I've also experienced is like there's actually sex work in a way feels to me like it gives us that gift in like showing us this overabundance of the things that we think that we need, until we're like, wait, I already was whole before I started this.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
I love that. That's a really great way to say that.
Yeah. Yeah. But I very much relate to your poem, and I liked it a lot. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Okay. So one thing, and then, one thing is I want you to just plug your upcoming book. And then after that, I'm going to ask you our 3 closing questions.
Sure. So, well, I'm going to actually plug my new book. So it actually came out yesterday.
Oh my gosh.
It's a very small book. It's a chapbook called My Dungeon Love Affair, a nonfiction chapbook. Came out through Stanchion Zine, but it's also available on Amazon. So if you just put in My Dungeon Love Affair, I think it comes up. If you put my name, it'll certainly come up. But this is actually like if you whittled away all the excess, this is the gemstones left behind of my memoir, my abandoned memoir. Yeah. This is like the most powerful parts of it. And it's interesting because when I did have the memoir on submission, as a proposal, not the whole thing, but some of the responses were like, this doesn't really need to be a book. This could be an article or this or that. And I thought that was just people trying to let me down nicely, but I was like, maybe there was something to that. Maybe I was, trying to tell too much, and that it really is something, the kind of experience that needs to be brought down to this essence of the most, memorable moments, and the moments where I experienced emotional change and things like that. So basically it's just a series of short scenes, vignettes. It's very much inspired by fairy tales. So there's a lot of references to different fairy tales and myths, and it's kind of like my journey through a fairy tale.
Nice. I like that idea.
And you can read it in an afternoon, because it's so short. So
Yeah, we'll definitely link to that.
Okay. Awesome.
Yeah. And okay, so we like to end the episodes with 3 questions. So the first one is, what are you reading?
Right now I'm reading a book that has nothing to do with the sex organ. It's a very
that's fine.
silly, it's a very like escapist book. I'm reading this book called The Honey Witch by Sydney Shields. It's really fun. It's like it's almost like Bridgerton meets a romantic fantasy. It's really fun. It has a sapphic romance. So I'm reading that. I was also at the same time, I've been putting it up and down, but I'm rereading Secretary by Mary Gateskill, which definitely is like a sex work book. Have you read that one? I'm sorry, it's not called Secretary. Secretary is the most famous story that's in it. It's called Bad Behavior. It's a story collection. I recommend checking out because it has, I think it's written during the 80s, but there's a lot of like Call Girl.
Who wrote it?
As would be the Mary Gateskill.
Okay, I'll check that out.
I think Call Girl is the term that they used in the book at the time. Type characters, but also a lot of BDSM, a lot of stuff along those lines. And I first read that book, I think, when I was 19 and hadn't done any of this stuff yet. So it's interesting to come back to it.
Oh yeah, I bet. Yeah. And so what are you listening to
at the same time?
Yeah.
I was listening to your podcast.
Oh, thank you. And what are you excited about?
I'm so excited for summer and having more energy to pour into my passion projects. I'm planning on kind of working less this summer and getting back to writing more and also getting back to reading a lot more. Like I really want to read the Chris Belcher book that you were mentioning. And I have a whole stack of sex work books I want to read and other books. And I'm also doing a lot of like new physical activity. I'm taking a lot of aerial dance classes and regular dance classes. So kind of reconnecting with old passions and returning to my body in a different way. So I'm really excited about all of that.
Yeah, that's great. So where can people find you and your work?
My website is www.stephanieparent, STEPHANIEPARENT.net. And my Instagram and Twitter are both SC_PARENT, SC_parent. But also if you just type in Stephanie Parent Writer into Google, it will come up.
Yeah.
but yeah, I tend to update the Twitter and especially the Instagram pretty frequently. So anytime I have a new workout, it will be there. And if you want to connect with me personally, I'm pretty good about looking at DMs and things like that. So
yeah, thank you so much. It was so nice to talk to you about your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us for another episode of When We're Not Hustling. I'm your host, Jessie Sage. You can find me on Twitter at sapiotextual or visit my website at jessiesage.com. The show was produced by Emily Foster and the music is by Benjamin J. Beninati. You can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Not Hustling Pod. To support the show and get sneak peeks, please go to patreon.com/sapiotextual. For more information about our show and what we do here, please visit our website at nothustling.com. Signing off. Have a great week.